Welcome back to our Science and Human Behavior series. I'm Carrie Woodward, a board certified behavior analyst and your resident expert on all things autism and early intervention.
I'm Javen Encarnacion. I'm also a behavior analyst and a curious learner, and I am an expert in micro hobbies and being in deep dives.
Now, before you jump ship thinking that this is just another boring science podcast, wait just a second. If you've ever been fascinated by how human behavior works, yours, your kids, your boyfriend or girlfriend, literally anyone's behavior, we're not only taking you through the foundations, but we're talking about how this is relevant in our everyday lives.
In this episode, we're diving into chapter 9, Depravation and Satiation. It's one of those chapters that seems simple at first, but it completely reshapes how we think about motivation. Like, ever wonder what motivates your Aunt Bethany to bring up politically divisive topics around the Thanksgiving table? We're getting into it.
Right, but instead of talking about mysterious inner drives or needs, Skinner asks us to look at the environment. What we call hunger, thirst, or even motivation is really about our history of reinforcement and the current conditions that make certain consequences more or less powerful.
Exactly. In this conversation, we'll explore how deprivation and satiation plays a role in behavior, how these ideas show up in everyday life, from therapy to parenting to your interactions with your friends, and marketing and social media, and what ethical questions arise when these principles are used to manipulate behavior.
So let's jump in. How does Skinner redefine what it means to be motivated? And what happens when we start to see our own habits, eating, scrolling, working, through the lens of deprivation and satiation? Okay, so Skinner argues that concepts like hunger and thirst and drive are not actually inner causes, but they're shorthand for environmental conditions of deprivation and satiation. So, Javen, let's talk about how does this redefine of motivation compare to traditional psychology? Like, does it still hold up how we would describe motivation today? What do you think?
It compares and contrasts to how we traditionally view motivation and deprivation and those those words, I guess, in behavior analysis and in culture in general. The
Right,
common vernacular will say that motivation is something intrinsic.
right.
So like you're motivated um to go to the store to get groceries, where I'm motivated to win the lottery. And so the idea is that there's something inside of us, this inner being ourselves, that is motivated to do something and to behave a certain way. And behaviorally, and what Skinner's arguing is that the contingencies or the factors that motivate us aren't actually within us at all, but they're external forces that are interacting on our behavior and on our states. He brings up the idea about drives too a little bit, and what he's saying is that where the motivation to engage in a particular response comes from our environment and our interactions with it and our history with the environment, locally in our immediate history as well as our extended history through time. Does what do you think about that and
Yeah,
that?
no, but and what I love about it is because it sort of takes it out of it being a me thing. Like if I am not doing the behaviors that I need to do to be successful, it's easy to just say like I lack motivation and there's something wrong with me, as opposed to being able to like look out at the environment and like what's happening in the environment, things that we can actually make some changes to in order to actually make a manipulation of somebody's motivation. And I think that's so cool.
And he refers to it, or he contrasts it with looking at the environment instead of inferring internal states. Like you're saying someone's thirsty. How do you know they're thirsty? Well, they're drinking water. And
Mhm.
so he says that they're actually motivating causes that can impact that. So he wants us to measure history of water deprivation or food access. What would this look like in a modern behavior analytic or therapeutic context? Can we fully avoid interstate language when explaining behavior?
I mean, I think that we have to, as behavior analysts, we have to, and it behooves us to try and explain this to the people that we are providing this type of service to as well. Because again, we can actually make changes when we know what's happening contextually in the environment in order to increase the probability of the desired behavior occurring, right? So, like, if, for example, we're trying to, in my field, get a young kid to start using language to request things, there needs to be inherent motivation there, right? And rather than talking about motivation being something that either a child has or doesn't have and over which we have no control, we look at it and say, how can we make them motivated for, I don't know, this specific tool? Well, if they're playing with Play-Doh and they don't have any of the tools available to them, we are able to sort of manipulate that deprivation of tools so that we can increase the motivation to use language to make a request. And I feel like that gives us like all of these amazing resources at our disposal to impact people's motivation and get them to do these behaviors that we're hoping to see happen more frequently. All right, so then Skinner gives examples like using salt to induce thirst or restricting food to elicit compliance or using satiation to reduce problem behavior. So, how do these examples relate to ethical considerations today? Obviously, when Skinner wrote this book, we were in a different place with ethics regarding manipulation of, restriction to food, for example. Are there contexts, like in education or therapy, where some of these same principles still operate and maybe even a little bit uncomfortably? What do you think?
Um, I think first of all that whenever Skinner was writing and conceptualizing this, I don't know that he was actually applying these principles in the way
Right.
that we do, you know?
Yes.
And so he was talking about it in more globally about how these processes are interacting and how they're occurring naturally, and sometimes they're contrived, and society even generates them. Obviously, they're at play with in various settings. So, in a therapeutic setting, for example, will increase the potency of items that we identify as potential reinforcers by restricting access to it in certain settings, or we might limit the access to something that is necessary for skill acquisition later. So later down the line, it's more powerful, which that's kind of like isolating too. But outside of a therapeutic context, with the access, when you think about something like money and demand for items like iPads, iPhones, where there are motivating factors that increase the likelihood that someone's going to purchase them because these external variables are constricting access in certain ways, or they're limiting people from acquiring them through financial means, making it really uh, a product that is really inexpensive to produce incredibly expensive, something like the Labubus. If you think about the motivating factors
Yes.
that are contributing to a $10 toy being $75,
Right.
that now ethically, is that right? I don't think so. I think there is, when you look at it and how they occur, especially naturally and in markets, I think it is unethical, but do we have the power to change that? That's a bigger question. In therapeutic settings, yes, but
Right.
globally, I don't know how much we have the power to change in that way.
Right. And I think that's the thing too. Like Skinner is not necessarily saying, here's how it works. Here are the tools, go out and do it. He's
Right.
explaining what's actually just happening naturally in our world. And so he's like taking these examples of stuff that actually does happen and explaining it from a behavioral perspective. And like as behavior analysts, because we have that power of knowledge, we do have an ethical obligation not to
Mhm.
use this level of like deprivation of food, right? For increasing motivation. We would not be ethical if we were doing that. But somebody who's like in a marketing position doesn't necessarily have those same ethical obligations. And so that's where it kind of becomes a sticking point.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to be aware of it. And what is unfortunate is how this approach hasn't been as adapted or adopted, I should say, in the wider context, because it does remove a lot of the blame. And I'll probably say that a lot throughout this podcast series, is that it removes the blame, because when motivation is something internal, and it's something that is initiated and caused and driven by the person, then they're responsible for their behavior and the results. And that's not to say that we don't have control, but whenever there are forces that are initiating those responses, then a lot of it is out of our hands in some ways. But he also, that does lead us into the next question about how he talks about drives. And I thought this was a part of the chapter that I had to reread a few times, because I felt like the idea behind a drive maybe it may have changed contextually then versus now.
Yes.
And that's a word that I don't really use much. And like he calls a drive a verbal device, not an explanation. So it kind of like where we're identifying it this way, it's not explaining what's happening. Is there value in keeping such fictions? For instance, do modern terms like motivation, cravings, urges repackage the same problem, or are they more empirically grounded? What you think?
Well, what's interesting is that I have seen a couple of different things recently talking about motivation as this sort of abstract, right? We really need to be discussing deprivation and satiation, but we do use that term, like a motivating operation. We do use it frequently in our field to discuss relative changes of like, whether or not this reinforcer is now more valuable to a person based on their history of deprivation or satiation with the item. Um, I feel like drive, I think that Skinner sort of like undid the need for drive in his further writings, in that we really don't need to even talk about a drive when we can simply just talk about what are the environmental variables that are at play, what is the level of deprivation of a given item, what are the other important variables necessary for a behavior to occur. Those are the things that we can see and they're observable and they're objective. And so I feel like as a researcher, we're better off just eliminating the use of that term in the way that we describe things anyway, because it's sort of like this unnecessary step. It's like when he talks later, we get into emotions, but it's like it may be part of a chain, but it doesn't necessarily explain. It's not a part of the functional relationship between variables and the behavior. And so we probably don't even necessarily need to have it included in the way we speak about it anymore. Do you agree?
I think that's one where I'm not sure what I think about,
Yeah.
or I'm not sure how the science has grown since then. And I think what I'm coming to terms with is that there are some things I don't necessarily have to have an opinion on because
Ah.
the idea behind drives, the way he broke it down, I could be wrong, but it seemed like it was talking about biological responses that have been selected through evolution for
Hmm.
a certain reason. And I think a lot of it comes down to passing on your genes and procreating. And so, in that context, I do agree that it's probably not necessary for us to refer to them. Maybe when we're talking about humans, especially with when language comes into play, but what about when language isn't, or when we're working with other animals? Like
Hmm.
certain types of breeds of dogs have a chase or a prey drive that's
Right.
incredibly powerful. So, though I think there are times where you might need to take it into consideration, I don't think it's practical, probably in a therapeutic or a more global context, but
Yeah,
I could be
you're
wrong.
right. I think like it does definitely come into play when we're talking about different species,
Mhm.
and so it has a place in that conversation for sure. When you said that, I was like, oh yeah, because you talk about different species, even like within breeds of a single species, and how their drives are very different based on their biological evolution.
I think, and to respond to that point, there is a risk of referring to drives for humans because there's this idea that, certain people of certain racial makeups have different biological processes, which is completely false. But
Right.
if we were to refer to drives as a rationale for behavior when we know that's not the case in most instances, it does become problematic and
I
it's not
had
pragmatic.
had never seen it that way, but that's a really good point. Okay, so then the last discussion point for this chapter, Skinner goes into talking about things like money, approval, affection, obviously, these generalized reinforcers. How does that come into play when we're talking about more modern things like social media, consumerism, digital addiction? How is Skinner's notion of deprivation and satiation apply to our relationship with attention and online approval? What do you think there?
So I want to refer to a study that I read about and a few friends of mine conducted back at Columbia University. So that's where my first exposure to conditioned reinforcers was through like observation, for example, was brought about. And what they did was they set up this context where they took a neutral stimulus, like paper clips or pieces of string, and they taught skills where two kids. So one kid, the target learner, wasn't receiving the neutral stimulus as a reinforcer. So
Okay.
they weren't receiving the paper clips or the sh pieces of strings for responses. But the other kid was, the other learner was. And so when the other learner responded correctly, they received pieces of strings or paper clips in a cup.
Okay.
And they started with a skill that was in repertoire. And they knew that the tokens had become, or that, the neutral stimulus had become a conditioned reinforcer through observation alone when the target student started crying and like reaching and lunging for the other child's cup. Now, on that
Wow.
side, that child didn't know that once the session was over, the we call it the Confederate learner, they were able to trade in those tokens, those items for something that they preferred. And so then they were able to do that for skill acquisition. So once that neutral stimulus was conditioned, they were able to use it to teach a completely new skill.
Okay.
All of that to say that the the capacity to observe someone accessing something and that something becoming a powerful item for us just through observation
Wow.
is present. So we have the capacity, and we don't have to see the effects of what their access is or anything like that. And so when you think about generalized reinforcers as items that not only are incredibly resistant to extinction, but they're also items that we can condition so we can take something neutral like praise, like money, like social media algorithms, and
Likes and shares.
yes, and turn it into something really powerful. Look at the billionaires, for example, who have more money than they can ever spend, yet they want more. So when you think about the ideas of motivation and satiation with generalized reinforcers, you're never it's incredibly resistant to those processes. So billionaires, they have more money than they can ever spend, yet they
There's no
still want more.
deprivation there.
There's no state of deprivation, but they're generalized reinforcers. Those reinforcers allow them access to a lot of other things. And so social media, likes, comments, these are things like praise. That praise became a conditioned reinforcer that is a generalized conditioned reinforcer that is then incredibly potent. And so when you see it online where everyone sees your praise, I think that the way Skinner conceptualized these processes, those specific things that you were bringing up are incredibly resistant to it. So that makes it a very different beast to handle and to try to adjust on an organism, on a human's
Yeah.
repertoire.
Well, and that's crazy. The whole idea of being able to just observe somebody receiving something that's neutral for us, but seeing somebody else get it can become the conditioning process that we
Hmm.
could then be sensitive to those neutral stimuli as reinforcers just by watching other people receive them. So, like, watching other social media people have like hundreds of thousands of likes makes likes more valuable for us, even when they don't actually do anything for us. That
Or
is
seeing
crazy.
someone have like a $10 Labubu, an ugly little
Yes.
creature.
Yes.
And I think the Labubu phenomenon was incredibly eye-opening, and it's a good example because there was a pop-up Labubu cafe here in Houston,
Oh my
and
God.
my friend, who is incredibly cheap, paid $75 for a Labubu.
Wow.
And she didn't even like the color, but and she knew, she was aware, she could identify that it's not,
Worth
it's a
it?
cheap item, it's not practical, yet the contingencies upon that context were incredibly powerful to occasion a response that she would never emit in another context.
Yes. Wild. Deprivation and satiation. Well, I think we've covered it well. And we'll wrap this one up and we'll come back with another chapter
Yep.
for everybody's viewing
Like,
interest.
comment, share, subscribe. All of those things really help spread the word on behavior analysis and the power of behavior analysis in our everyday lives.
I love it. All right, see you on the next one.
It's the best.